Picture this. A torch flickers in the darkness, casting shadows that crawl across stone walls. The air is thick with incense smoke, sweet yet suffocating, pressing against your lungs. Somewhere in the silence, a single anklet trembles against the floor, its metallic echo swallowed by the vast chamber. Behind a carved wooden door, muffled cries slip out, then vanish like whispers erased by power. A golden throne gleams at the center of the room, surrounded not by worshippers, but by trembling bodies. Forced into stillness, the silence here is not peace, it is fear. Every breath belongs to someone else, every movement dictated by unseen eyes, and what unfolds in this chamber will scar centuries. The story begins in ancient India, a land of kingdoms and empires, a land of temples carved from mountain stone, a land where devotion and desire often walked hand in hand. This was a civilization of astonishing brilliance, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, poetry. Yet within its grandeur were shadows, too deep to ignore. Power shaped faith. Faith shaped power, and together they shaped the bodies of the vulnerable. Kings sat upon jeweled thrones, believing themselves chosen by the gods. Priests whispered scripture, twisting devotion into chains. Nobles built temples where beauty was not only worshipped, but consumed. What followed was not devotion. It was control for women and young girls. The body was no longer their own. It became an offering, a currency, a symbol of loyalty, a sacrifice demanded not by the divine, but by men cloaked in holiness. Behind the stone idols with jeweled eyes lay rituals of submission. Behind the chanting drums and bells lay silence filled with fear. Behind the silk veils of the temple dancers lay stories the world chose to forget. Imagine standing there at dusk, the sky burning with red embers of the setting sun, a procession of candles moving into the sanctum, the fragrance of sandalwood thick in the air. Chants rising like waves, drowning the cries of the unwilling. From the outside it looked like worship. From the inside it felt like captivity. This is where cruelty was reborn as sanctity, where innocence was transformed into duty, where silence itself became a prison. And what unfolded in these palaces and temples would not only scar the women forced to obey, it would ripple through families, communities, and generations. The echoes of their suffering still linger in the shadows of history, hidden between the lines of sacred texts erased from the triumphs of kings, yet alive in whispers carried across centuries. What followed would shatter lives. What followed would reveal the darkest corners of power and desire. The palace stood like a fortress of gold and marble. Its walls gleamed under the sun, but its secrets belonged to the night. Beyond the courtyards, beyond the gardens, beyond the public halls lay a labyrinth of corridors. The harem, the chamber of silence. Here, the king's power was measured not in armies or riches, but in how many trembling souls bent to his command. Women brought in from distant lands, daughters of nobles offered as tribute, servants chosen not for skill, but for beauty, temple dancers handed over as gifts to please the ruler. Each door in the harem opened into a world of waiting velvet cushions, perfumed air silks woven in patterns of paradise. Yet beneath the beauty was a suffocating truth. This was not a sanctuary. It was a prison girl of 15 led through the corridor, her anklets trembling louder than her breath. She passes carved pillars glowing under torchlight. Every step feels heavier than the last. Behind her, the guard closes the door. The sound echoes. Like a verdict, in these chambers silence was demanded. Laughter was rare. Tears were forbidden. The king entered with the certainty of a god. Every glance was ownership, every gesture a command, every smile a blade. Imagine the weight of his gaze, the silence that followed, the women seated in lines, their bodies adorned in jewels, their eyes stripped of freedom. From the outside, it looked like devotion. From the inside, it was fear wrapped in silk. At night, the air was heavy with incense, a sweetness masking The scent of sweat and fear, torches sputtered along the stone walls, casting shadows that trembled like captives. The sound of anklets jingling blended with muffled sobs, and the guards patrolled with faces carved of stone psychologists. Today would call it conditioned obedience, the slow erosion of will until silence becomes survival. Fear becomes habit. Obedience becomes the only language left, but within this silence were fragments of humanity still alive, a whispered song hummed by one girl. To calm another, a stolen glance of compassion, a hand that lingered a moment longer to remind someone they were not alone. These were small acts, yet they were seeds of defiance, hidden in plain sight, carried in gestures too fragile for power to notice. A king never saw this. To him, the harem was a trophy hall, a reminder of his control, a mirror of his hunger. And yet behind every jeweled veil was a story of a stolen life. Behind every anklet's jingle was a pulse of quiet resistance. Behind every forced smile was a memory of freedom that refused to die. This was the palace behind closed doors, a world of velvet shadows and golden chains, a world where fear ruled by silence and where cruelty wore the mask of pleasure. But darker truths waited. Still beyond the palace walls, inside the sacred temples, where faith itself would be twisted into ritual, and innocence would be disguised as devotion. The temple stood like a mountain of stone, carved by centuries of devotion. From afar it looked like heaven on earth, towers spiraling into the sky, walls alive with gods and goddesses dancing across sacred carvings. But step inside, and the air shifts, the fragrance of sandalwood heavy enough to choke the lungs, the sound of bells echoing like chains, the silence between chants sharp enough to cut the soul. Here, the Devadasi system was born. At first spoken of as sacred young girls dedicated to the gods, married not to men, but to the divine, their lives promised to the temple, their bodies pledged as offerings of purity, their dance considered prayer, their beauty described as divine light. But behind the veil of holiness, another truth lived. In the shadows, dedication soon became possession, faith became captivity, sacrifice became exploitation. Imagine a child of 9, dressed in ornaments, her skin shimmering with oils, her hair braided with flowers. She stands barefoot on the cold stone. The floor before her looms, the idle jeweled eyes watching from the dark priests chant mantras that echo against the walls. The incense swirls so thick it blinds her tears. In that moment she is told she is sacred, that she belongs not to herself, but to the temple, that her body is no longer her own, but a pathway for divine will. But the divine never touched her. It was men cloaked in holiness, priests, nobles, patrons, each reaching out as though her body were another form of offering what was painted. As devotion was in truth ritualized abuse, what was celebrated as tradition was a system of ownership. The Devadasi became both worshipper and prisoner. Her dance was prayer, yet her nights were captivity. Her body praised in public, yet consumed in secret. Imagine the silence that wrapped her life. No escape, no marriage, no children of her own, only service endless and unquestioned. Psychologists would call this spiritual manipulation, the slow erosion of self until obedience feels sacred, until pain feels like destiny, until silence feels like duty. The temples became theaters of contradiction, stone walls echoing with hymns of liberation, while inside lived generations of women who had never known freedom, their bodies recorded as sacred, but their cries erased as blasphemy. This was not faith, it was power dressed as worship, cruelty disguised as ritual, obedience woven into religion. And still, in the faint notes of their songs, in the silent strength of their dances, a quiet resistance lived, a reminder that even within chains, the soul still whispers of freedom. But the temple was only one face of the darkness. The practices that followed would strip obedience even further, would turn faith into terror and devotion into violation. Night inside the sanctum was never truly silent. The lamps burned with thick oil, filling the air with a bitter smell that clung to skin and throat. Shadows crawled across carved walls, and chants rose louder and louder until they drowned every other sound. This was the setting for initiation rites. Young girls brought forward, their faces, painted their bodies, wrapped in silk, hands trembling as priests whispered that this was devotion, that this was destiny, but devotion was only a mask. Behind it lived cruelty. The girl's bangles clinked as she tried to hold her hand steady, but when fingers of power reached out, she flinched. The bangles cracked against stone, shattering into pieces that scattered across the floor. The fragments glittered like broken promises. Screams never rang free. They were muffled by the roar of drums, by chants rising like waves, by the heavy breath of men who hid behind holy. Words fertility tests followed, a woman forced to prove her worth not by choice, not by love, but by ritual defilement. An ordeal that stripped her body of dignity and her soul of peace. Each breath a prayer not for blessing, but for survival. Imagine the terror of being surrounded by stone idols, their jeweled eyes unblinking, as if complicit. Imagine the smell of burning oil mixing with sweat, fear and incense, until the air itself felt poisoned. Imagine hands pressing against the skin, leaving behind bruises that no one would dare name. This was not faith, this was domination crafted into ritual. Psychologists today would describe it as trauma bonding, fear laced with moments of false reverence, pain redefined as duty, silence forced until it became the only language left. The cruelty went beyond the physical. It was psychological terror, etched deep into memory. Girls told they were chosen by gods, but treated as offerings for men. Women told their suffering was holy, that their silence protected honor, that their endurance preserved family. Honor became another chain. To resist meant shame. To escape meant exile. To speak meant death of reputation, worse than death of body. So many complied not out of devotion, but out of fear. Not out of reverence, but out of the crushing weight of silence. Yet within this silence something stirred, a fragment of self that refused to vanish, a memory of freedom, a whisper carried from one woman to another in stolen moments between rituals, a lullaby, sung to herself in the dark, a line of poetry scratched into stone, a dance movement that shifted from obedience to defiance so subtle no one could see, small, fragile, yet alive. The cruelty had stripped autonomy. The rituals had enslaved body and mind. But no system, no matter how vast, can extinguish the ember of resistance. And so amid the burning oil and the echoing chants, amid the shattered bangles and the poisoned incense, a whisper began to travel through the silence, a whisper of rebellion. Stirring. Amid chains there was silence, but within silence there was survival. The women who lived through these rituals were not only victims, they were survivors shaping defiance. Into the smallest of gestures, a dance that appeared like worship, yet carried secret meanings. Steps that shifted ever so slightly, telling stories of pain and hope only other women could read. A song sung at dusk meant as prayer, but within its melody, a hidden code. A memory passed down, a quiet reminder that they were not alone. A hand brushing another in the dark, a glance held longer than custom allowed, a whisper carried through corridors when guards had turned away. These were not grand rebellions. They were seeds, small acts that refused to let cruelty claim the soul entirely. The temple demanded obedience, the palace demanded silence, but within obedience women hid endurance. Within silence they stored fragments of truth. One girl danced each. Night before the idol, the crowd saw grace. The priests saw devotion, but she imagined each movement as wings of flight, her body in chains, her spirit in motion. Another wrote lines of poetry on palm leaves buried under stone, words never meant for. The priests, words meant for the future. a testimony hidden away like a secret heartbeat. Even in forced fertility trials, some women refused to surrender their dignity, turning rituals into acts of endurance, transforming pain into strength. Knowing that survival itself was resistance, psychologists today would call this adaptive resilience. The ability to carve meaning from cruelty, to bend without breaking, to find life inside captivity. And in these small acts of survival lay the power of memory. Because cruelty thrives on silence, but memory whispers louder than chains. Centuries later, we may never know every name, every story, every detail of those who endured, but we can feel their presence in the cracks of temple walls, in the worn steps of sanctums where their feet once moved, in the fragments of folk songs that still echo across villages. Their resilience is a haunting hymn carried across time, and it leaves us with a question. If they could carve survival out of silence, if they could hide defiance in chains, what will we do with our freedom today? The night of the great ritual arrived. The temple was alive with fire, hundreds of lamps burning oil, filling the air with thick smoke, drums pounding in rhythm like the heartbeat of the gods, bells echoing so loudly they swallowed even the thought of silence. Crowds gathered outside, believers waiting for blessings. They saw the temple as a place of salvation. But what unfolded inside was something else entirely. You stand in the inner sanctum. The air suffocates with incense so heavy, it clings to your skin. The floor is cold stone, slick with oil, and before the towering idol, a young girl kneels, trembling, her ornaments rattling like chains. Priests circle her, chanting, their voices low and thunderous, hands raised as though summoning the divine. But their eyes do not rest on the idol, they rest on her. Her humanity erased, her body transformed into symbol. A sacrifice disguised as ceremony. The drums grow louder, the chanting intensifies, and the child is lifted forward, placed before the idol as though she is no longer flesh but offering. Imagine the terror in her breath, the flicker of her eyes searching for escape in walls that give none, the way her hands tremble, clutching the silk around her body, her anklets ringing each time she moves like a cry for help, too soft for anyone to hear. And then the ritual begins, priests reaching out cloaked in robes of holiness, touch disguised as blessing, violation disguised as sanctity, each gesture sanctified by chants, each abuse masked by ritual, each moment of cruelty legitimized by faith. This was the climax of power, cruelty institutionalized as worship, violation celebrated as tradition. The crowd outside heard only bells and believed prayers were answered. They never saw the tears hidden beneath painted eyes. They never felt the bruises that the silks would later hide. They never knew the silence forced upon her would last a lifetime. Psychologically, it was devastating to tell a victim they were chosen, that their suffering was holy, that their obedience was a gift to gods and kings. It erased selfhood. It rewrote trauma as duty. It carved silence into the deepest part of the soul. For the priests, this was control perfected. For the rulers, this was obedience guaranteed. For the women inside, it was captivity without chains. Yet heavier than iron, generations endured this ritual cycle. Bodies reduced to symbols, voices erased as blasphemy, humanity rewritten into devotion. What was worship became weapon. What was holiness became horror. What was devotion became domination. And as the ritual ended, the girl was led away, her ornaments still shining, her eyes dimmed, her spirit fractured. Outside, the bells rang as though the gods had been pleased. But inside, only silence remained. This was the turning point where cruelty no longer hid in shadows. It stood in the open, wearing the mask of holiness, and the world bowed before it. Cruelty institutionalized as faith power, eternalized as devotion, humanity sacrificed on the altar of silence. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, Temples crumbled, palaces turned to dust, but the silence remained. History carved its stories into stone, celebrating kings who conquered lands, and priests who built sanctuaries. The victims were erased, their names never written, their suffering buried beneath hymns and praise. Official records spoke of devotion, of ritual, of glory, but in the spaces between the lines, another truth lived generations and carried the scars silently. Families whispered warnings to daughters: never walk alone, never question the priests, never raise your voice. The trauma lingered not in words but in fear. Fear woven into customs, fear passed through gestures, fear buried in lullabies sung to children without explanation. Even in villages centuries later, shadows remained, a glance that lasted too long, a silence when certain stories arose, a nervous laugh when temples were praised too heavily. The echoes of captivity did not die with the women who endured it. They traveled forward through bloodlines, a silent inheritance of pain, and culture itself carried contradictions. Songs that celebrated devotion yet hid cries of loss, stories that honored gods while silencing their stolen daughters. Festivals that rejoiced in tradition, while forgetting the cost paid by generations of women. The walls of temples still stand, their carvings still admired by travelers and historians. But the stone remembers more than beauty. It remembers tears that fell into cracks, whispers carried into shadows, silence heavier than chants, cinematic silence now. Imagine walking through one of these ancient halls today. Your footsteps echo against the same stone floors, the air still scented, faintly of incense, the carvings still alive with gods in eternal dance. But if you listen closely beneath the echoes of tourists and guides, you might hear something else, a softer echo, a cry left unfinished, a silence that has never healed. The glory of kings is remembered, the piety of priests is celebrated, but the women are shadows, their stories unnamed, their humanity erased, and yet the silence of history is never complete. Because memory lingers, because trauma whispers, because truth waits. Scars of these practices shaped culture. They shaped fear, they shaped silence, and even today they remind us that what is erased does not disappear. It only waits for someone to listen. The story draws to a close, not with justice, not with redemption, but with silence. For centuries, the walls of temples stood tall, their carvings celebrating kings, gods, and rituals. Yet beneath that stone, the voices of countless women remain buried unheard. Power wrote history, and history chose to forget, but memory lingers in the cracks. In the songs sung in whispers, in the hesitation of women stepping into certain courtyards, in the unspoken fear passed down through generations. This was never faith. It was power masquerading as holiness. And when cruelty hides beneath devotion, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. Because who dares question the sacred? But memory has a strange way of surviving. It haunts, it waits. It reminds us that the past is never truly gone, only hidden. And so, as we leave these stories behind, the air hangs heavy with a single echo, a reminder that while names may be erased and stories silenced, the walls themselves bear witness. The walls remember even when history forgets.